If you were to hold a contest today for the most unusual aircraft of World War II, Dornier's creation, the Do.335 Pfeil, which translates to arrow in English, would easily take one of the top spots. Unlike a lot of other bizarre experimental projects, this arrow actually turned out to be a surprisingly capable combat aircraft. In fact, it remains one of the fastest piston-engine fighters in all of aviation history. If German engineers had had enough time to iron out the technical issues that constantly plagued its development, and if they had managed to get it into mass production, they would have had an absolutely exceptional fighter on their hands. It could have easily held its own against literally any Allied aircraft of the time. So it's no surprise that after the war ended, Allied forces were incredibly eager to test captured examples of the Do.335. That being said, the era of the piston engine was already coming to a close, and the rapid advancement of jet technology quickly rendered the German arrow completely obsolete. Despite its highly unusual aerodynamic design, the Do.335 wasn't an entirely new concept, nor was it some closely guarded secret dreamed up by Claude Dornier. The tandem push-pull configuration, where the engines are placed one right behind the other, had been used in aviation as far back as World War I. You can see it on early aircraft like the Fokker K-1, the Fokker M9, and the Siemens Schuckert DDR-1. During the interwar period, various countries experimented with similar designs. Just think of the French Arsenal 5G-20 or the Dutch Fokker D-23. Usually, these aircraft shared a very distinct look. They featured a short, central fuselage shaped like a teardrop pod. The front engine drove a conventional tractor propeller, while the rear engine drove what's known as a pusher prop. Because of this, designers typically relied on a twin boomtail section. This allowed them to mount the rear engine as close to the aircraft's center of gravity as possible. But this is exactly where they hit a major engineering hurdle. If you want to use a conventional, longer fuselage, you have to transfer power from the rear engine to the pusher prop using a long metal drive shaft. And that inevitably creates severe harmonic vibrations that can literally tear the airframe apart in mid-air. That's primarily why early attempts to build a functional aircraft with a tail-mounted pusher prop and a long drive shaft almost always ended in failure. On top of the vibration issues, this layout had another major drawback. On aircraft where the rear prop was mounted behind the tail section, the effectiveness of the control surfaces dropped dramatically. The powerful airflow into the prop simply washed out their inputs. A twin boomtail design let them partially bypass these issues. But it came at the cost of a massive increase in aerodynamic drag. It wasn't until the early 1940s that designers finally figured out how to successfully solve the harmonic vibration problems of that long drive shaft. And one of the aircraft that spearheaded this technological breakthrough was the German Dornier Do.335. So why were engineers so eager to make this push-pull layout work? It had some clear advantages, the biggest being significantly lower aerodynamic drag. It gave the aircraft a perfectly streamlined classic silhouette with clean wings. It was completely free of bulky external engine nacelles. At the same time, it kept all the benefits of a twin-engine aircraft. It offered plenty of excess power and the redundancy to keep flying if an engine suddenly failed. What's more, on conventional twin-engine planes, losing an engine created deadly asymmetric thrust that would yaw the airplane hard to one side. But with a centerline thrust layout, both engines pushed the aircraft perfectly straight, so that problem simply didn't exist. As a nice bonus in combat, that massive rear engine acted as a built-in armor shield, protecting the pilot's back from enemy fire. But the inherent flaws of the design could not be ignored either. That huge rear propeller was a serious hazard if the pilot ever had to bail out in a hurry. There was also the constant risk of a tailprop strike during takeoff or landing. And finally, flight testing showed that the Do.335 suffered from poor longitudinal stability. Because the torque from the front and rear engines was not perfectly matched, the aircraft had a constant, subtle pitching motion in flight. It was almost like porpoising over waves. Trying to lay down accurate fire on an enemy target under those conditions was incredibly tough. To really understand the backstory of the Do.335, we have to look at the man who created it. Claude Dornier was part of that first generation of brilliant German aircraft designers. Going all the way back to 1910, he worked for the legendary Zeppelin Company. He eventually moved to their aviation branch. His real signature as an engineer was his heavy reliance on all-metal construction instead of the traditional wood and fabric used at the time. Early in his career, Dornier fell in love with the tandem engine layout. On his massive RS-2B flying boats, he was the first to mount pairs of engines in tandem nacelles. The front engine drove a tractor prop, and the rear acted as a pusher. Over time, this push-pull configuration became his calling card in the aviation world. Between the two world wars, Dornier certainly was not sitting idle. To get around the strict limitations of the Treaty of Versailles, he set up manufacturing through foreign subsidiaries in Italy and Switzerland. That is where he designed a whole lineup of highly successful flying boats. One of them was the famous WWII, which is German for whale. The aircraft proved so reliable that it was built under license in Japan, the Netherlands, and Spain. Even back then, Dornier was heavily experimenting with the tandem engine layout. On the Do.18, for instance, the rear engine used a specialized extended drive shaft. And here's the crucial part. Dornier was the first designer in the world to completely engineer out the severe vibration issues caused by these extension shafts. This was a problem everyone else thought was unavoidable. All of this invaluable hands-on experience inspired him to take an even more ambitious leap. He realized that if you buried both engines deep inside the fuselage and used a conventional tail, you could build a unique twin-engine fighter. This design would have incredibly low aerodynamic drag. In late 1937, this brilliant concept was officially patented. The design outlined an airframe built around three main sections. Up front, an engine drove a conventional tractor prop. The center section housed the cockpit and all the essential systems. And out back, a second engine drove a pusher prop right at the tail. Once the patent was secured, Dornier immediately got to work on this revolutionary aircraft. It was initially given the project designation P-59. His engineering team drafted several concepts, but they selected the most promising one for development. It was a sleek, single-seat aircraft powered by twin DB601 engines. The designers calculated that this airplane would reach an impressive 470 miles per hour at an altitude of 16,400 feet. The layout was highly unconventional, utilizing a push-pull configuration. One engine was mounted in the nose, driving a forward tractor propeller. The second engine was tucked directly behind the cockpit, driving a rear pusher prop through a long extension shaft. To keep that rear engine from overheating, they added dedicated flush air scoops to the sides of the fuselage. The aircraft featured a cruciform tail. This cross-like shape was strictly necessary to prevent the rear propeller from striking the runway during takeoff and landing. To further reduce drag, the landing gear fully retracted into the wings. However, back in 1940, the German military high command was overconfident. Hermann Göring made it clear that funding would only go to projects capable of delivering immediate tactical results on the battlefield. As a result, the innovative P-59 was abruptly canceled. But Dornier was not the type to just give up. To prove his centerline thrust concept actually worked in reality, he asked Dr. Ulrich Hütter to build a heavily simplified proof-of-concept demonstrator. That is how the experimental G09 was born. Essentially, it was a scaled-down version of the Do-17 bomber's fuselage. It was a lightweight single-seat airplane. It was powered by a modest air-cooled HM60R engine, producing just 80 horsepower. They mounted the engine right behind the cockpit. It drove a four-blade pusher propeller through a long extension shaft. The G09 took to the skies for its maiden flight in early 1940 over the town of Maiden. Flight testing continued for over a year. The little airplane managed to hit 137 miles per hour. But more importantly, the engineers finally figured out how to resolve the dangerous driveshaft vibration. The results completely exceeded their expectations. Wasting no time, Dornier was already working in parallel on his next design. It was designated P-231. This was a full-fledged, formidable combat aircraft featuring a modern tricycle landing gear setup. After a series of refinements, they settled on a final production version. It was powered by two massive DB603G engines, with each producing 1,900 horsepower. This ambitious design would eventually enter aviation history under the legendary designation Do.335. It earned the nickname Pfeil, which is German for arrow. In 1942, right as development on the arrow was in full swing, the strategic situation started deteriorating rapidly for Germany. Allied bombers were appearing over German cities with increasing frequency. The British de Havilland Mosquito was proving to be an absolute nightmare for German air defenses. Thanks to its twin engines, it was so fast and agile that it could excel as both a fighter and a bomber with equal efficiency. Meanwhile, the German Bf-110 was hopelessly obsolete by this point. It was really only useful for night fighter duties. A genuine mosquito panic started sweeping through the German high command. Realizing just how outclassed their own aircraft were against this threat, the military issued an urgent requirement. They needed a brand new, versatile twin-engine multi-role aircraft. The specification demanded a top speed of 800 kilometers per hour, or roughly 500 miles an hour. It also required the ability to carry a 500-kilogram bomb load. They sent this request out to the major aerospace manufacturers. These were Arado, Junkers, and Dornier. But neither Arado with their heavily modified older airframes, nor Junkers with their underdeveloped EF-115 design could offer anything truly capable. That left Claude Dornier's design as the undisputed frontrunner in the competition. However, the competition was not about to just roll over and quit. In late 1942, Willy Messerschmitt unveiled his own concept, the Bf-109Z. This was despite the fact that he had not even been officially invited to the competition. Essentially, it was two standard Bf-109 airframes bolted together. The Reich Air Ministry actually took an interest in the idea. A prototype was completed. But unfortunately for its creators, it was destroyed by Allied bombs before it ever had a chance to make its maiden flight. In early 1943, Willy Messerschmitt went a step further and pitched a new concept. It was practically a carbon copy of the design by Dornier. This triggered an official investigation, wasting precious time. On top of that, Dr. Passewald, the head of development at the technical office, stalled on signing the Dornier contract at every opportunity. This foot-dragging went on until the company took the issue straight to Field Marshal Erhard Milch. Milch heard them out and ordered the contract signed immediately, but even then, the order was heavily scaled back. They only asked for 12 prototypes with just 8 to be built right away. They also included a limited pre-production run of 35 aircraft configured as fast bombers. Full-scale mass production was not even slated to begin until February 1945. Things changed dramatically when Adolf Hitler himself took an interest in the unusual aircraft. In 1943, he was practically obsessed with the idea of fielding a high-speed bomber that could strike Allied invasion fleets before they could even establish a beachhead. His personal interest gave the Do.335 project a massive boost and top priority status. But Willy Messerschmitt was seriously worried about the fate of his Me-262 jet, the Schwalbe, or Swallow. He managed to convince the German leader that his own aircraft was nearly ready to be deployed as a fast bomber. He suggested keeping the Do.335, known as the Pfeil, or Arrow, strictly as a backup program. On September 7, 1943, Hitler decided to do exactly that. Field Marshal Milch tried to protest, but this time it was no use. The Do.335 was relegated to backup status. Regardless, the first prototype was already prepped for its maiden flight. The first Do.335 took to the skies from the factory airfield in Friedrichshafen on October 26, 1943. Flugkapitän Hans Dieterle, the chief test pilot for Dornier, was at the controls. He was an incredibly skilled aviator. Back in 1939, he had set a world absolute speed record in the HE-100 prototype. He pushed it to a staggering 464 miles per hour. Generals Peltz and Peterson, who had traveled in specifically from the main test center, were on hand to witness the flight. The new aircraft made a fantastic impression on them. Design-wise, the first Do.335 was a single-seat, all-metal, low-wing aircraft. It featured a fully retractable tricycle landing gear. The heart of the design was its unique push-pull configuration. It was powered by twin DB603 engines. Each one cranked out a massive 1,750 horsepower on takeoff. Because of the unusual annular radiator fitted to the front engine, from the outside it actually looked like the nose was housing a radial engine. And as with most initial prototypes, this very first aircraft flew completely unarmed. The pilot ejection system on this aircraft deserves a special mention. Bailing out the old-fashioned way was practically impossible. It was also way too dangerous because of the rear propeller and the massive tail section. To solve this, engineers equipped the airplane with a pneumatic ejection seat. They also added a special emergency jettison system for the rear propeller and tail. The bailout sequence went like this. The pilot had to hit 3 buttons in a row. The first instantly blew off the rear propeller, the second jettisoned the tail section, and the third armed the ejection seat. After that, the pilot just had to pull 2 levers. This blew the canopy off and launched the seat straight into the air. Because of this, the Dornier Do.335 went down in history as only the second German piston-engine aircraft to be fitted with an ejection seat. Overall, the maiden flight was quite a success. However, some issues popped up right away. The airplane was unstable during straight and level flight, and the tail control surfaces just lacked authority. But by its 4th test flight, the prototype managed to reach 373 miles per hour right down at sea level. The test flight showed that the aircraft actually handled quite well. Even more interesting was a quirky little detail. When flying solely on the rear pusher engine, the airplane was actually faster than when flying solely on the front tractor engine. Even with only one engine running, it easily reached speeds of up to 348 miles per hour. But the biggest technical headache reared its head right from the start. This was the chronic overheating of the rear engine due to insufficient airflow. Engineers were never able to fully fix this issue. It plagued the program right up until the day it was canceled. Subsequent testing was carried out on a series of new prototypes. For example, the second prototype featured an improved annular radiator and updated landing gear doors. The third prototype got modified exhaust stacks and a redesigned wing leading edge. Incidentally, this third airframe was later used as the baseline for creating the reconnaissance variant of the plane. The 5th prototype was the first to be fitted with live armament. This consisted of a powerful, long-barreled 30mm cannon. It fired directly through the forward propeller hub. There were also 2 20mm cannons mounted right above the engine. However, the initial weapons testing was a complete failure. Because of that same in-flight instability, pilots simply could not aim accurately. This happened no matter what airspeed they were flying. This unfortunate reality seriously jeopardized the future of the Dornier Do.335 as a fighter, at least until engineers could finally resolve the issue. On April 15, 1944, the development program for this unique aircraft suffered its first truly devastating loss. While performing a low-level test flight, the rear engine of a Dornier Do.335 prototype suddenly caught fire. The flames spread to the airframe incredibly fast. They damaged the flight control linkages. Having lost all control, the heavy aircraft plummeted straight into an anti-aircraft munitions depot near the German town of Memmingen. Test pilot Werner Altrauger was killed instantly. The massive explosion at the military depot was incredibly destructive. Not a single piece of wreckage was left of the airplane. The pilot's body was never recovered. Meanwhile, engineers put the final prototype through a rigorous testing program. This was in preparation for full-scale series production. The aircraft received heavily reinforced landing gear and full combat armament. This included a powerful Mk-103 cannon with 70 rounds of ammunition. It also had 2 15mm MG-151 machine guns. The critical test flights at the Reckland test facility were flown by engineer Heinrich Boe. He was a highly experienced test pilot. He had flown practically every type of aircraft in the Third Reich. He was the one who pushed the heavy Do.335 to an impressive 472 miles per hour. At the time, only the Me-262 jet fighter and the rocket-powered Me-163 Comet could fly faster. In simulated dogfights against the formidable FW-190, the heavy twin-engine Pfeil consistently came out on top. The word Pfeil means arrow in German. If caught at a disadvantage, the pilot could simply firewall the throttles. He could instantly pull away from any pursuer. No other piston-engine fighter, German or Allied, could catch it in level flight. Boe also praised the aircraft's ergonomics. He noted that the cockpit was spacious and comfortable. It offered outstanding visibility to the front, sides, and below. The only major design flaw was its extremely poor rearward visibility. This made it incredibly difficult for a pilot to check his SIGs. While testing was underway, the political landscape surrounding the program shifted dramatically. The ambitious idea of converting the Me-262 jet into a high-speed bomber was failing to live up to expectations. So, in May 1944, the head of the fighter staff, Karl Otto Sauer, had the backing of Armaments Minister Albert Speer. Together, they managed to convince Adolf Hitler to give the Do.335 project top priority. They ordered it into series production immediately. The official order came down on July 7, 1944. But crucial time had already been lost. Allied forces had successfully landed in Normandy and opened the second front. Meanwhile, the Arrow was still stuck in its testing phase. Assembly of the first 10 pre-production Do.335A0 aircraft was set up in the town of Oberpfaffenhofen. This location was chosen strategically. It was situated well away from the main aviation plants. Those plants were being relentlessly pounded by Allied bombing raids. The first aircraft of this batch finally took to the skies on September 30, 1944. The heavy fighter was powered by two massive engines. It had a DB603A2 in the nose and a DB603QA2 in the rear. These drove massive three-blade propellers measuring 11.5 feet in diameter. Interestingly, the propellers featured reversible pitch. This reduced the aircraft's landing roll significantly by as much as 25%. The main fuselage tank held 325 gallons of fuel. Meanwhile, the two wing tanks held 89 gallons each. If the mission called for it, an additional 132-gallon auxiliary tank could be installed in the bomb bay. As for armament, it packed a heavy 30mm Mk-103 cannon. This fired straight through the forward propeller hub. It also had two 20mm MG-151/20 cannons mounted above the front engine. Most of these pre-production aircraft were used exclusively for testing and evaluation. A few airframes were destroyed on the ground during Allied air raids. Another was lost in a crash in December 1944. Almost immediately after the pre-production models, the factories started assembling the full-fledged production Do.335A1. The main difference was the use of the new DB603E1 and DB603QE1 engines. They produced 1,800 horsepower on takeoff. At an altitude of 5,900 feet, their maximum output reached 1,900 horsepower. The exact number built of this variant remains unknown. But judging by historical records, there were no more than 10. Most of them were left unfinished on the assembly line. Soon after, the German High Command ordered a shift in production to the next variant, the Do.335B. As for the few A1s that were already completed, they were converted into two-seat trainers. They received the A12 designation. The thing is, the highly unusual engine layout and unique flight characteristics of this plane required a dedicated trainer to get pilots up to speed. There were a couple of trainer variants. These were the Do.335A11, based on the pre-production 0 series, and the Do.335A12, based on the first production run. Both versions shared a very distinctive visual feature. They had a raised hump for the instructor's cockpit, positioned right behind the pilot. As a side note, not a single trainer file was built from scratch. All 8 trainers produced were obtained exclusively by heavily modifying and converting existing combat airframes. Meanwhile, German engineers were working on a much more powerful version of the aircraft, the B series. The issue was that the early variants had a major flaw as interceptors. Their armor and armament were just too weak to effectively take on tough Allied bombers. Because of this, the Do.335B one-day fighter received significantly thicker cockpit armor. The next model, the Do.335B2, hid 2 extra 30mm Mk-103 cannons inside its wings. This gave it a total of 3 extremely powerful cannons of that caliber. They planned to equip the Do.335B3 variant with upgraded DB603LA engines. These featured a 2-stage supercharger, pushing out a staggering 2,000 horsepower on takeoff. The U.S. military actually captured a few test examples of this variant at the Oberpfaffenhofen plant. This happened while the airframes were still in various stages of assembly. German engineers even seriously considered mounting a massive 55mm Mk-112 cannon. Just a single hit from a weapon like that would guarantee the destruction of any Allied bomber. However, before the war ended, the Germans only managed to produce 10 of these cannons, and not a single one was ever actually fitted to the Arrow. In the summer of 1944, it became obvious to the German High Command. The Do.335 would make an incredibly effective night fighter. The airframe combined excellent flight performance with plenty of internal volume. It easily accommodated heavy weapons and bulky radar gear. This led directly to the Do.335A6 project. Designed for a two-man crew, it featured a radar operator station positioned right behind the pilot. It came complete with its own ejection seat. The main fuselage fuel tank had to be scaled down to roughly 160 gallons, but this was offset by adding a pair of standard 300-liter drop tanks. Thanks to the MW50 water methanol injection system, the DB603E engines could still push out 2,000 horsepower. The plan was to install the Telefunken FUG-220 Liechtenstein radar. Eventually, they would replace it with the more advanced FUG-218 Neptune. Designers also intended to mount the new X4 wire-guided air-to-air missiles under the wings. The first prototype of this night fighter made its maiden flight on January 24, 1945. Mass production was slated to begin at the Heinkel plant in Oranienburg. However, the facility was already operating at full capacity building the HE-162. Because of this, the assembly line for the new night fighter never got up and running. Despite these setbacks, the High Command pushed forward. They ordered a batch of 52-seat Do.335B6 night fighters from Heinkel. All of them were equipped with FUG-220 radar arrays. These were scheduled for delivery to the Luftwaffe by April 1945. However, the first prototype of this variant was not even completed before the war ended. Ultimately, the unfinished airframe fell into French hands as a war prize. Building on the Do.335, engineers also developed an ambitious concept. It was for a long-range recon aircraft designated the Do.335Z. The letter Z stood for Zwilling, which is German for twin, also known as the Do.635. This aircraft was intended to replace the aging FW-200 Condor and Ju-290. The standard version of the aircraft was not suited for these missions. It simply lacked the range. The military needed a plane capable of flying at least 3,700 miles unrefueled. Designers came up with a radical yet straightforward solution. They would join two Do.335 fuselages together. They would use a brand new center wing section that housed massive internal fuel tanks. Initially, the project was assigned to Heinkel. They already had experience with this kind of design from the HE-111Z. Development was later transferred to Junkers. This is when the aircraft was redesignated as the Ju-635. The project was fleshed out in extreme detail. The wingspan of the center section alone was nearly 25 feet. The total fuel capacity reached a staggering 4,600 gallons. Plans called for a reinforced landing gear system and state-of-the-art avionics. This included a specialized FUG-200 Hohentuel maritime patrol radar. Major Fisher represented the long-range reconnaissance units that worked closely with U-boats. He demanded even more capability. He insisted the range be increased to nearly 5,000 miles. The plane also needed enough speed to easily outrun enemy fighters. However, given Germany's disastrous situation on the front lines, one thing became painfully obvious. Actually putting such an ambitious design into production was impossible. As a result, the program was officially canceled on February 5, 1945. When looking at the Do.335 as a whole, it never really saw any full-scale combat. This unique aircraft was still in the early stages of development. Mass production was only just getting underway when Germany was forced to surrender. Because of this, only a handful of these fighters ever actually made it into operational service. Back in September 1944, the German High Command formed a special test unit. It was called Erprobungskommando 335. Its primary mission was evaluating new aircraft under actual combat conditions. The unit was equipped with several Dornier 335 A0 pre-production aircraft. It likely had a few A1 variants as well. The hand-picked pilots were tasked with developing effective combat tactics for 3 different roles. These included a high-speed interceptor, a fast attack bomber, and a reconnaissance aircraft. Command of this elite unit was entrusted to Hauptmann Alphonse Meyer. Interestingly, on October 26, 1944, the German Air Ministry had to issue a special directive to all of its flak batteries. It specifically detailed the silhouette of the new aircraft to prevent friendly fire. The issue was that the plane's cruciform tail and unusual push-pull twin-engine configuration were highly unconventional for the time. Anti-aircraft gunners could easily mistake it for an Allied plane. The Dornier 335 actually saw very little direct combat. In mid-April 1945, pilots from No. 3 Squadron of the Royal Air Force were flying Hawker Tempests. They intercepted a German Pfeil over the Elbe River. The unusual aircraft was tearing away at tremendous speed. It was first spotted by the famous French ace Pierre Clostermann. Later on, Dornier 335s were also encountered by American pilots flying P-51 Mustangs. In both cases, the German aircraft outran its pursuers with incredible ease. It left the Allied fighters in the dust. The most famous German pilot to fly the Dornier 335 was Major Wolfgang Schnauffer. He was a top-night fighter ace with 121 aerial victories. He personally evaluated the aircraft and gave it incredibly high marks. He predicted it would make a formidable night fighter. The test unit flew its final combat mission, a ground attack sortie, on the night of April 27, 1945. One of the last and most famous flights of the Dornier 335 took place in late April 1945. German engineer and test pilot Hans Werner Lersche was at the controls. He was tasked with a highly dangerous mission. He needed to ferry the classified aircraft from the Rechlin test facility down to Oberpfaffenhofen. Flying right on the deck to avoid detection, Lersche maintained a speed of around 550 kilometers an hour, or roughly 340 miles per hour. He navigated purely by visual landmarks. Facing rapidly fading daylight and critically low fuel, he was forced to make a risky stopover near Prague. There, he managed to barter for some scarce, high-octane avgas. He paid for it with standard packs of cigarettes. On April 23rd, the Dornier 335 took to the sky once again. During the flight, the plane flew through heavy anti-aircraft fire. Miraculously, it emerged without a scratch. At his next stop, an Allied air raid hit the airfield the moment his wheels touched down, yet the aircraft somehow survived unscathed. After handing over classified documents, Lersche took off for his final destination. Without even retracting the landing gear, he successfully completed the ferry flight. As it turned out, this would be the final flight of a Dornier 335 under wartime conditions. This specific airframe was incredibly lucky. Not only did it survive the war, but it remains intact to this very day. In April 1945, American troops captured the Dornier factory at Oberpfaffenhofen. They seized all the aircraft on site. Most of the Do.335s they found were either heavily damaged or sitting half-finished on the assembly line. Only 2 were fully operational and airworthy. As part of Operation Seahorse, the Americans decided to ferry these prize captures to the French port of Cherbourg. Colonel Harold Watson flew one aircraft. German test pilot Captain Hans Padel took the controls of the other. Once in Cherbourg, the unique aircraft were loaded onto the British escort carrier HMS Reaper. On July 20th, they set sail across the Atlantic. They journeyed alongside 38 other rare captured German aircraft. After arriving in the States, one of the surviving Do.335s went to the U.S. Navy. However, flight testing at Naval Air Station Patuxent River dragged on. The complex engine layout plagued the aircraft with constant breakdowns. This led American engineers to conclude that the design was a dead end. In 1947, the aircraft was moved to Naval Station Norfolk. It sat there for years until being transferred to the Smithsonian Institution in 1961. The second Do.335 brought to the U.S. never flew again. This was due to persistent, unresolvable overheating issues with its rear engine. However, parts from the second aircraft eventually proved vital. The original wings from the first aircraft mysteriously vanished without a trace. As a result, restorers had to use components from both airframes to piece together a single, complete display model. In May 1974, the Smithsonian received an unexpected request. It came from the Deutsches Museum in Munich. They were asking to borrow the captured aircraft for display. The Smithsonian agreed. They made the historic decision to send the Do.335 back to its homeland. On October 10, 1974, the disassembled fighter was loaded into a Boeing 747. It was then flown to Frankfurt. From there, a military C-130 Hercules cargo plane ferried it straight back to Oberpfaffenhofen. A painstaking restoration process ran from July to December 1975. The team had to scour the globe to find 31 missing cockpit instruments. They also had to completely rebuild the missing wooden structural components from scratch using original blueprints. On June 27, 1983, the U.S. officially gifted the unique aircraft to the Deutsches Museum. However, in the early 90s, the aircraft crossed the Atlantic one last time. Today, it is proudly displayed at the National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C. Meanwhile, 2 other captured Do.335s were handed over to the British Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough for detailed evaluation. Legendary British test pilot Captain Eric Winkle-Brown, alongside experienced Wing Commander Rowley Falk, were highly impressed with the captured aircraft's flight characteristics. They concluded that if German engineers had had a little more time to iron out the bugs, the Do.335 would have been a truly phenomenal fighter. But history had other plans. On January 18, 1946, one of these aircraft was lost in a fatal crash. During a test flight, the rear engine suddenly caught fire. The flames quickly burned through the flight control cables. The heavy, completely uncontrollable aircraft then plunged into a local school building in the town of Cove. Tragically, the test pilot was killed on impact. The only other country that took a real interest in the Do.335 turned out to be France. In late April 1945, units of the French First Army captured the town of Mengen. There, they unexpectedly found 3 examples of this unique aircraft, known as the Pfeil, or Arrow. One of these airframes was completely burned out and beyond repair. However, the other 2 were ideal for further evaluation. The first was airworthy, while the second was nearing completion on the assembly line. In May 1945, a special technical intelligence team led by Captain Merles arrived on site to evaluate the captured aircraft. The airworthy plane was carefully dismantled and transported to a flight test center in Brittany. On August 8th, the restored aircraft took to the sky for the first time. It was flown by French pilot Paul Baudret, the chief designer of the VB-10. But the flight did not go as planned. Passing through an altitude of about 3,300 feet, the plane experienced severe vibration. This was immediately followed by thick smoke. Baudret was forced to immediately shut down both engines. The heavy aircraft lost altitude rapidly and touched down hard on the runway. With no brakes, it rolled at high speed and slammed into a parked B-26 bomber. Surprisingly, both aircraft suffered only minor damage. Investigators later discovered the crash landing was caused by a thrown connecting rod in the front engine. In September of that same year, the damaged aircraft was sent to a facility near Paris for repairs. But things took a bizarre turn. During the overhaul, the ejection system accidentally fired. It launched the pilot's seat with such incredible force that it punched right through the hangar roof. Following this string of mishaps, the repaired aircraft did not return to the base in Brittany until 1946. In February 1947, the plane was fitted with its original armament. On March 13th, it took to the air again. This time it was piloted by Captain Roger Recevaux. The test flight lasted exactly 45 minutes. Over the next year, however, this highly complex machine logged barely 9 hours of flight time. Funding for further research completely dried up. On September 5th, 1948, the test program was officially canceled. Overall, the aircraft showed fairly modest performance, but this was largely blamed on low-quality fuel. It was only when they finally filled the tanks with proper 100-octane avgas that the plane's flight characteristics noticeably improved. As for the second recovered Do.335, it was fully assembled by captured German mechanics. It made its maiden flight on April 2, 1947. Over the course of a few subsequent flights, test pilots carefully evaluated the aircraft's handling at various speeds. They even pushed the envelope. They intentionally put the aircraft into a stall and spin with both engines completely shut down. But on November 27, 1948, while performing a routine taxi on the runway, the aircraft's right landing gear strut suddenly collapsed. After assessing the damage, officials decided not to waste any more resources repairing it. By March 1949, the airframe was permanently scrapped. Ultimately, the Do.335 never became a reliable asset for the French Air Force. Besides, the jet age was already well underway. This made any performance advantages of piston-engine fighters completely irrelevant. In total, only 61 Do.335s were built before the end of the Second World War. This included all the experimental prototypes. A large number of airframes were simply left unfinished on the factory floor. In the end, the story of the Pfeil is a classic tale of an incredibly promising aircraft. It arrived just a little too late to make an impact.